Steve Harvey sat down expecting a regular interview. What he got instead was a raw, emotional message from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett that made him break down in front of millions. It started like any other segment. Steve Harvey stood center stage sharp in a dark burgundy suit, with a gold tie, the kind of outfit only he could wear without looking like he was trying too hard. The crowd was in good spirits. Laughter echoed from earlier jokes. A few guests had come on to promote a cookbook and a local charity. Easy stuff. Nothing too deep, just Steve doing what Steve does, keeping it moving, keeping it light. Then the producer gave him a signal. 1 minute till Jasmine Crockett. Someone whispered in his earpiece. He nodded without thinking too much about it. He'd met her once briefly backstage at an event in Dallas a year earlier. Young Congresswoman, sharp, confident, carried herself like someone who didn't need to prove anything. But this was daytime TV. Politics wasn't really the vibe. He figured they'd talk about voter turnout or community programs. Maybe toss in a few jokes to keep it digestible. But when Jasmine walked out, heels clicking across the stage floor, something in the room changed. It wasn't dramatic, nothing loud, no music shift or gasps, just quieter, still, almost the way a room feels when something important is about to happen, but no one knows it yet. Steve greeted her with his usual charm. "Well, look at you," he said with a grin. "You done brought the Congress into this studio, huh?" Laughter. Jasmine smiled, but it wasn't wide, it was tight. "Thoughtful. I brought something else too." "Mr. Harvey," she said, sitting down. Steve raised an eyebrow, half smiling. Oh, do I need security?" The crowd chuckled again. Light moment. But Steve noticed something right away. Her hands were folded a little too tightly in her lap. She wasn't nervous. It was something else. She was holding something, embracing. "You always been funny," Jasmine said, voice steady but soft. "Since I was a kid." That's when Steve sat back in his chair. He'd done thousands of interviews, thousands of stories, but he knew that tone. It didn't come from politicians. It came from people with a truth they had carried for too long. "Let me ask you this," Jasmine continued. "Do you remember being broke? Not like struggling famous. I mean broke, lights off, oatmeal for dinner, your friends too embarrassed to play at your house." Steve didn't answer right away. He blinked. "Yeah," he said, finally, quieter now. "Yeah, I remember well. That was us," she said. "Lubbock, Texas. My grandmother raised me while my mom worked doubles at the hospital. We had a 10-inch TV in the kitchen. It was cracked in the corner, but it worked just enough, and every morning before school that TV came on." Steve tilted his head. He already knew what was coming, not the details, but the rhythm of it, the kind of story that doesn't just sit in someone, it grows. "Every morning," Jasmine said again, "no matter what. My grandmother had one rule. We don't miss Steve Harvey. You were our joy in that tiny kitchen with no heat. You were the only thing that made my grandmother laugh." She'd slap her thigh and say, "That boy's got sense." Steve exhaled. Not dramatically, but his shoulders dropped just a bit. "And when I got older," she continued, "when I was the only black girl in my college debate class, when I was called aggressive for just speaking up, when I was told I should try something more traditional, you know what I'd think of?" Steve looked up at her, now direct. "I'd think about how you got booed off stages, slept in your car, got back up again and again. I thought if Steve Harvey could survive all that, then maybe I can too." The studio was still. No laughter now, just a long beat of silence, where even the lights seemed to dim. Steve leaned forward slowly. "And you came all this way to tell me that?" Jasmine nodded once. "Not for a headline, not for votes, just so I could say thank you to your face, because you didn't know it, but you were helping raise me from a TV screen." But Jasmine wasn't done yet. There was something heavier still sitting behind her eyes, something more personal. For a second, Steve just looked at her. There was no follow-up question, no joke ready. He wasn't trying to fill the air. Something in her words had landed hard, deep. The kind of thing that makes a man revisit places he thought he'd left behind. But Jasmine sat steady, almost too steady, as if the only way to get through the next part was to keep her spine locked and her voice level. She said, "I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning in February. I was maybe 11. My mom had worked an overnight shift and fell asleep in her scrubs on the couch. My grandmother was boiling water to make grits, and the power cut off mid-pot." Steve raised his eyebrows, lips pressing together. It wasn't the first time, she added. She didn't say anything, just sighed and lit a candle. She didn't panic. She just said, "Go turn on, Steve. We still got the little kitchen TV." Jasmine smiled faintly. "That TV cracked screen, bent antenna still picked you up like it was sent straight from God. You had on that bright yellow suit. You were talking about how you used to take baths with dish soap because money was too tight for both groceries and bubble bath." My grandmother laughed so hard she dropped her spoon. Steve finally let out a chuckle, but it was laced with something else. Not quite pain, maybe memory. She looked at me and said, "See, he ain't ashamed. He remembers. That's how you stay good when things get better. Don't ever forget the worst." Jasmine paused, her throat catching a little. My grandmother's gone now, been gone 6 years. She never got to see me sworn in, but she's the reason I got through every day of law school, every campaign speech, every debate, and she taught me that even in the hardest times laughter was necessary. She turned slightly towards Steve, and you gave us that. Steve rubbed his jaw, eyes flickering toward the floor for a second. Then he looked up, not as a talk show host, but as a man who'd heard something real. Can I tell you something? He asked quietly. Jasmine nodded. I used to sleep in my car behind a gas station in Akron. I'd crack the window just enough to breathe, tuck my coat over my lap. One night, I got out, walked into the gas station, and the clerk, young kid, probably 20, said, "Hey man, you're that funny dude from that club downtown." I said, "I guess." He gave me a microwave burrito for free, no words, just slid it across the counter and said, "You made my girl laugh so hard." She snorted. Jasmine's eyes glistened, and she let out a tiny laugh. "That's what kept me going," Steve continued. "Not money, not fame, stuff like that. People finding joy when everything else felt like hell." The studio was still quiet, but now it was filled with something else, understanding, that invisible current that moves between two people when the walls come down. Jasmine sat back, finally relaxing a little. We lived on Section 8 housing, vouchers, food stamps, hand-me-downs from the church, but somehow every week my grandmother found a way to make fried chicken on Sundays and smile through it. Steve nodded slowly. "Women like that don't just survive, they raise empires." She raised one, Jasmine said, "and part of it was through your stories, your voice." She looked out at the audience. "Now some people think television is just noise in the background, but when that's all you got, when you don't know if the lights are coming back on or if your mama's going to make it through another double shift without falling asleep at the wheel, that voice becomes more than just a voice. It becomes part of your family." Steve's eyes were misty now, though he kept blinking like he could fight it off with willpower alone. He finally said, "I ain't never been thanked like that before." But Jasmine wasn't finished yet, not even close, because behind all the gratitude was something she had carried for years, something that no amount of applause could fix. Jasmine leaned back just slightly, like her body needed a second to release something it had been holding on to for years. Her voice dropped lower now, not from tiredness, but from the weight of where she was about to go. "I never told anybody this," she said, almost like a confession. "Not my team, not the press, not even my closest friends." The audience stayed locked and completely silent. "I got denied from 2 law schools because they said I wasn't a strong cultural fit." That's the actual phrase they used. Steve let out a slow breath, his face tightening, not in anger, but in recognition. "I finally got into one," she continued, "in Fort Worth. It wasn't fancy, it didn't come with the big scholarships or name brand prestige, but it was a chance, and I took it." She paused. "But I hated almost every minute of my first year." Steve blinked. "Why?" "Because I wasn't invisible. I was watched. Every word I said, every question I asked in class. If I was too quiet, I was uninterested. If I spoke up, I was too bold. And it wasn't just students, it was professors too." She leaned forward, now elbows on her knees. "I was one of 3 black women in the entire program, and every time I thought about quitting, I would remember something my grandmother said. When they don't see you, make them feel you." And I swear, Steve, I would hear that in your voice, those old comedy bits, that speech you gave at that business expo about sleeping in a car and how God don't give you a dream without a way through it. I had it on repeat. Steve leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, as if steadying himself. "Sometimes," Jasmine said, "I'd be crying in my car outside the campus, hands shaking, not sure if I could walk back in there. But I'd put on my headphones, here you say something ridiculous, like if you pray about it, don't worry about it, and it would pull me together just long enough." "Law school," Steve murmured, "that's a grind most people don't understand, especially when you're carrying all that extra weight." Jasmine nodded. "And even when I made it through past the bar, started working, the judgment didn't stop. I'd walk into courtrooms, and people assumed I was the assistant or the court reporter. Let me guess," Steve said, "they'd ask where your lawyer was." She smiled grimly. "Every time." Steve shook his head, low chuckle escaping. "They don't know who they talking to now." "I didn't want to run for office," Jasmine admitted. "Not at first. I thought, why would I sign up for even more people trying to silence me? But then I remembered all the nights my grandmother and I watched you making people laugh when you probably didn't feel like laughing. And I realized sometimes our purpose doesn't ask us if we're ready, it just shows up." Steve nodded slowly, eyes locked on hers. "So I ran, and when I won, I didn't celebrate the way most people did. I drove to the cemetery, sat on a little folding chair by my grandmother's plot, played one of your old stand-up sets on my phone, and I said, 'We made it.'" Steve looked down, and for a second, he didn't speak. The crowd could sense something building in him, not performative, not for ratings, just a man realizing the depth of his reach, something that fame alone could never measure. Jasmine he said, finally lifting his gaze. I don't even know what to say to that, she smiled softly. You don't have to say anything, but the real moment hadn't happened yet. Not until she looked him in the eye and said the words that would make a grown man cry in front of millions. The camera zoomed in slowly, almost unconsciously, like it too sensed that the next few moments needed to be closer, more intimate. Jasmine looked over at Steve, really looked. There was something in her eyes, something raw, unfinished. She sat up straighter, folded her hands again, then unfolded them. She was trying to steady herself, but her voice came out low and firm. I didn't come here just to thank you. Steve straightened a little. All right, she inhaled. I came to tell you something I've never said out loud, not to anyone. Steve leaned in slightly, a hand resting over one knee. My grandmother was diagnosed with congestive heart failure during my second year of law school. She didn't tell me right away. She didn't want to distract me, she said. But by the time I found out, it was already moving fast. Jasmine's voice cracked just slightly, but she kept going. She was in and out of the hospital that fall. I drive 6 hours back home just to sit by her bed. On weekends, she'd always make me turn on your show from her hospital room. The nurses thought it was strange, an old woman asking for reruns of a talk show while hooked up to IVs. Steve let out a breath through his nose, eyes locked on her, unmoving. She told me that man's voice calms my heart more than any medicine they got. Jasmine smiled briefly. And the last day I saw her, she asked me to promise her something. What was the promise? Steve asked. Jasmine blinked fast, then met his eyes. She said, if you ever meet that man, you look him in the eye and tell him he mattered, not to the world, not to television, to me, to us. Let him know he helped raise you when I couldn't do it all by myself. The room went still. Steve's hands were folded now, his lips pressed tight, his head tilted slightly, as if the words had landed somewhere he didn't want anyone to see. And I told her I would, Jasmine said. But then she died 3 days later. I missed the funeral. I was in court trying to be somebody, trying to prove I belonged. Steve opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He looked away briefly, as if trying to slow something rising too quickly. So this, Jasmine gestured around her, this isn't just a TV moment for me. It's me keeping a promise. It's me finishing a conversation I never got to have. Steve's eyes shimmered now visibly wet. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with his fingers and exhaled deeply. You said something once, Jasmine continued, in an old interview. You said your gift might not be meant for you. It might be meant for someone watching, someone listening, someone you'll never meet. And I remember hearing that and thinking, that's me, I'm that someone. Steve finally spoke, but his voice was rough. You never know who's watching. You never know what your words are really doing. Exactly, Jasmine said. And I know there are thousands of girls like me, black girls, poor girls, invisible girls, sitting in front of cracked TVs or phones or whatever they got, listening to somebody who sounds like he sees them, even if he doesn't know their names. A tear finally rolled down Steve's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Your grandmother was right, he said quietly. You turned out just fine. She would have loved to hear that, Jasmine whispered. The audience stayed silent. Not one cough, not a shuffle of a purse or rustling of jackets, just breath being held across the room. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Now I've gotten awards, honors, money, fame. But that what you just gave me, that's the kind of thing I'll carry to my grave. He paused. That's the kind of thing that reminds you why you started. But something deeper was bubbling under the surface now, a lifetime of effort, mistakes, redemption, and questions Steve had never spoken out loud until now. Steve sat quiet for a while, his hands laced together, fingers tightening and loosening, like he was trying to work through something inside himself. Not the kind of silence that's uncomfortable, the kind that's honest, necessary. I've never told anybody this, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, but there was a time back in the 90s, right before I got that radio gig in Dallas. I was done trying. I had 2 kids to feed and nothing coming in, couldn't even afford a bus ticket to my next gig. I sat on a bench outside a Greyhound station in Little Rock and thought about just walking away, giving up, disappearing. Jasmine didn't speak. She just let him have the space. I didn't know if anybody cared. All that laughing I did on stage, people didn't know it came from pain. That was me trying to survive. He paused and chuckled softly, shaking his head. Then this old man came and sat next to me, didn't know me from nothing. He looked over and said, you look like somebody who's made people laugh before. Don't let the devil steal that. Then he got up and walked away. That was it. Jasmine's mouth opened slightly. Steve continued, that one sentence, it sat in me like a brick. I took the next bus, bombed the show, but I kept going because I started to believe, maybe, just maybe, I wasn't meant to quit, that I still had something to give. He looked at Jasmine now. And now here you are sitting across from me telling me, I helped raise you, girl. You have no idea what you just gave me back. Another tear dropped from his cheek, and this time he wiped it But Jasmine wasn't done giving. My grandmother used to say that God don't always give you thanks in real time. Sometimes you gotta wait 20 years to find out you were part of somebody's miracle, she said. Steve let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but heavier. You know what's wild? He said, all the success I've had, TV shows, Family Feud, books, suits, endorsements, none of it hits like this. Not a single trophy can hold a candle to hearing I gave a little girl in Texas a reason to keep going. He paused again, eyes darting away for a second, as if embarrassed by his own emotions. I think sometimes, he continued, people see folks like me on TV and think it's all been easy, that we always had it figured out. But the truth is, I was just trying to survive long enough for someone to believe in me. And the truth is, I didn't always believe in myself. His voice wavered again. And now you're sitting here with poise, power, all that brilliance. And you say you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for me. That's more than I ever thought I'd hear in this lifetime. Jasmine leaned in slightly. I meant every word. Steve rubbed the corner of his eye. He looked around the studio. The camera crew had stopped moving. Producers behind the curtain weren't signaling anymore. Even the audience, dozens of them, sat in what felt like a holy pause. No one dared interrupt. I spent so many years thinking the job was just to entertain. He said that if I could make people laugh, I'd done enough. But this is bigger. This means I left something behind that mattered. You did, Jasmine said. You still are, Steph. He nodded slowly. My mama used to tell me that the way you treat people is your real legacy, that if your name ever comes up in a room after you're gone, let it come with warmth, with respect. He glanced at Jasmine. You just gave my name that warmth, she smiled, holding his gaze. It already had it. Steve looked down at his hands, then back up again. And for the first time in a long time, he looked still. No stage persona, no act, just a man in full, sitting with the truth of his life's meaning. But even as the emotions settled, one more surprise was waiting, a moment that would take this conversation far beyond the studio walls. The interview technically ended 10 minutes ago, but no one moved. No one behind the cameras signaled for commercial. No assistant came running in with a clipboard. It was like the whole building had agreed this moment needed more room. Steve stood up slowly. Jasmine rose too. They hugged, not the quick, polite kind meant for daytime TV. This was longer, heavier, a thank you wrapped in arms, a goodbye, and a beginning. At the same time, when they finally pulled apart, Steve cleared his throat. Y'all excuse me, he said to the audience, voice shaky. I need a minute. He walked backstage without fanfare, no music, no lights, just quiet footsteps as he disappeared behind the curtain. Jasmine stayed seated. Someone in the audience clapped once gently, then more followed. But it wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't about performance. It was gratitude. Backstage, Steve stood alone in the green room. He looked in the mirror, not adjusting his tie, not fixing his jacket, just staring for a man who had stood in front of millions for decades. This was the first time in a long time he didn't feel like a performer. A production assistant walked in holding a phone. Mr. Harvey, she said hesitantly, sorry to interrupt, but we're getting flooded with messages. Social media is going off. People are sharing their own stories. He turned to her. What kind of stories? She handed him the phone. Tweets, comments, messages from people across the country. A woman in Tacoma talking about how she watched Steve stand up after losing her brother. A man in Albuquerque who said Steve's book helped him stop drinking. A retired teacher in Des Moines who played clips of his show during her morning homeroom for her ESL students, just so they could learn English through laughter. It kept going. Hundreds, then thousands. Steve set the phone down gently and just whispered, man. Jasmine, meanwhile, had stepped outside. She stood by the studio lot entrance, arms crossed in front of her. The air was warm. She didn't need a ride. Her team was waiting, but she didn't rush to leave. A woman approached her, late 50s, pressed Slack's hands, trembling a little. I saw the show, she said, breathless. They let us watch from the side. I'm a janitor here, been working this building for 12 years. I wanted to thank you. Jasmine looked at her, surprised. The woman continued, I have a daughter. She's in community college right now, wants to be a lawyer. She's the only black girl in the program. Last week, she told me she didn't think she could do it, but I'm calling her tonight. I'm going to tell her about you. Jasmine reached out and took the woman's hand. Tell her she already has what it takes. Jasmine said she just needs to remember who she is. They stood like that for a moment, two women, different generations, linked by something deeper than blood. Truth inside Steve came back out. The audience was still there, still seated, still quiet. They gave him a soft applause as he returned to his chair. Though the segment had long ended, he sat down, looked straight into the camera, and said, I don't know who needs to hear this, but whatever it is you're doing that feels small, that feels unnoticed, keep doing it. Somebody out there is watching you, counting on you. You might never know their name, but your voice might be the thing that saves them. No music played, no applause sign was flashed, just silence again, full, deep reverent. That night clips of the interview spread like wildfire, not because it was dramatic or scandalous or viral-worthy, but because it was human, real, and in homes across the country from Compton to Omaha to St. Petersburg, people sat a little quieter in front of their TVs, remembering who helped raise them, remembering voices that carried them through. Steve went home and sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't reach for his phone. He just sat and whispered to himself it was worth it. But there was still one thing left to say, one reminder that tied everything together, not just for Steve and Jasmine, but for everyone watching. A few days later, Steve sat in his dressing room at another studio, different city, different show. The usual pre-show buzz was happening outside the door, voices, tech checks, people making sure everything ran on time. But Steve wasn't moving. He was staring at a folded piece of paper. He'd kept it in his coat pocket since the day Jasmine Crockett sat across from him on set during the break. She had handed it to him without saying a word. Read it. When you're alone, she'd said, now in the quiet. He unfolded it. It wasn't long, just a few handwritten lines. Dear Mr. Harvey, this isn't for the cameras. This is for you. Thank you for being the voice in our kitchen, the laughter in our storms, the example that made us believe we could do more than survive. You weren't just part of our mornings, you were part of our becoming. With love and respect, Jasmine. Steve read it twice, then folded it again and placed it gently into the inside pocket of his jacket. Like something sacred, he stood up and looked at himself in the mirror, not to fix his tie, not to check his smile, but just to look, to see the man he'd become. There were bags under his eyes, wrinkles that had grown deeper over the years, but there was something else. 2 pieces later that evening, he went live on Instagram. No lighting setup, no production, just him in a simple room, holding his phone. I want to say something, he said. I've been in this business for a long time, 30+ years, and I've had a lot of success. But every now and then God reminds you why you were really put here. He paused. Last week, a young woman named Jasmine Crockett sat across from me and changed my life. She reminded me that we don't always get to see the good we do, but we should never stop doing it anyway. He shifted the camera closer to the teachers, bus drivers, janitors, pastors, lunch ladies, barbers, and yes, even talk show hosts who think nobody sees them. Somebody does. Somebody is watching, and that little thing you said, that small kindness you offered, it might be the reason someone doesn't give up. He held the phone steady, not blinking. Keep showing up, even when it feels like no one notices, even when it feels like it doesn't matter, because one day someone might walk into your life and say the words you didn't know you needed to hear. He ended the live. No hashtags, no promo, just truth. Meanwhile, Jasmine went back to Washington. Her days were filled with committee meetings, votes, constituent calls, and long hours that felt thankless more often than not. But something inside her felt lighter now, fuller. In the middle of all the noise, she had spoken her truth, and it had landed exactly where it was meant to. One afternoon, after a long session, she sat on a bench outside the Capitol. She scrolled through her messages. One caught her eye. It was a photo, a little girl, no more than 10, holding a homemade sign. It read, I want to be like Congresswoman Crockett. There was no caption, no explanation, just the image. Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment, exhaled, and smiled. The chain was continuing. This was how it worked. One voice lifts another, and then another, until generations are carried by words they never even heard in person, but still felt in their bones. Steve kept the letter. Sometimes he took it out before a show, sometimes he didn't, but he always knew it was there, and Jasmine kept the photo of that little girl on her desk, right next to a framed picture of her grandmother, who'd always believed in laughing through the fire. The moment had passed, but the message stayed. If this story meant something to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let someone know they matter. And if you've got a Steve Harvey in your life, someone who changed your path without even knowing it, tell them while you still can. Never underestimate the power of simply being present, whether it's through a word, a laugh, or a quiet moment on a small TV screen. In a world where everyone is trying to survive, to be seen, to be heard, sometimes you, without even realizing it, are the light in someone else's darkness. If someone has ever helped you through a hard time, whether through their words, their humor, or the strength they showed, don't keep it to yourself. Say it. Be grateful. Let them know they made a difference. And if you're someone just doing your best each day, as a parent, a teacher, a bus driver, a janitor, a storyteller, and you wonder if what you're doing really matters, believe that it does. Someone is watching you, learning from you, holding on because of what you give, even if you never see it. Don't wait until it's too late to say thank you. Don't wait until someone is gone to tell them they were a hero in your story. And finally, If you're carrying a dream, a story, a truth you've never spoken, don't be afraid. Share it, because maybe, just maybe, your voice is the one that will save someone else, the way Steve Harvey once did, without even knowing. You matter. You are enough. And your voice, in the right moment, in the right way, can change a life.